For the longest time in the series, there was one extremely popular theory in the community that I couldn't wrap my head around: Molten MCI. And I don't mean the theory itself, that being follow me in FNAF 3, or that's most commonly assumed. William returns to Freddy's for Remnant, taking it back to the Sea Bear bunker and melting it down into a liquid used inside of the Fun Times to give them life. If I understand the theory itself, then what's my issue? Well, because that theory requires you to assume that sister location was always planned to exist, despite the fact that we had known FNAF 3 was originally intended to be the end of the series, and FNAF 4 also threw around the term final chapter a lot, which for a story planning to add a 5th entry doesn't sound right. We would later find out in Scott's interview with Daco that he saw FNAF 1 through 3 as their own trilogy, and had made FNAF 4 after people were disappointed in the gameplay of FNAF 3 and sister location as the result of FNAF 4 seemingly making a mess of the series' lore. But Molten MCI is heavily evident inside of the series, as in the 4th closet we see the exact same plot point get used, mixed with some mentions from the Candy Cadet messages. So we're sitting at a paradoxical standstill, where future content suggests this event should happen, despite that future content not originally being planned. Well, at the very least, not in the form we got it in. If only there was something introduced in the original trilogy that is related to Remnant, like some sort of different form of Remnant. Oh, yeah, I already answered this one in a few videos back. The Shadow Animatronics. For those of you who don't know, the Shadow Animatronics are the result of something called Agony, which is a form of Dark Remnant. To simplify this, Remnant is a material made of memories, where bad memories become Agony, a semi-physical material that can exist where it pleases, more so tied to specific locations, but occasionally used in other locations such as, presumably, Midnight Motorist, while other memories are tied to physical items, as a metalish goo, and I want to propose that the metalish goo remnant was none other than Scott's infamous Retcon. Another piece of information from Scott's interview, as well as a few Reddit posts here and there were a few details mentioned about this sort of area, that being 1. The contents of the box have changed over the series. 2. Scott couldn't confirm whether the good ending or bad ending of FNAF 3 was canon, stating it was more complicated. And 3. Mentioned by a Reddit post, there was only one retcon in this series, but Scott didn't consider it a noticeable or debated issue at the time, which I think the existence of Remnant works fine with these descriptions. But let's show what I mean in action. During the release of the FNAF movie, you may remember the argument of the eyes not having the black down, what's the word? Sclera, I think it's called, and white irises. This detail for the characters was seen all the way back in FNAF 1, and while absent in the movie, you have to remember that Shadow Freddy is a costume in that continuity, so we can still use this as evidence in-game for lore. We see this effect make its way into FNAF 2 from every character in the game, while excluding Withered Bonnie, but that's not his fault. We would see this effect continue all the way into FNAF 3, where all the Phantoms would also have this design. Even Afton. Why is that important? Well, despite some miscommunications about how Springlock suits work, the costumes do not contain an endoskeleton at all, rather just the clamps and rods used to hold the costumes onto one, which means these eyes we see are good old Aftons. That means these light-up eyes are not the result of hallucinations or lights in the back of the animatronic suits, but rather proof of a character having agony inside of them. Isn't it suspicious that the piles of costumes is where the spirits rise from, while the remnant is supposedly somewhere else? Okay, let's talk about the ending of FNAF 3, which very clearly shows a representation of souls via the masks laying on the ground. When they are all still possessed, they have this light inside of them, almost as if the agony is tied to the costumes, Whereas after Happiest Day, the agony of these characters is already put to rest, allowing for those eyes to no longer glow, and for the original children to pass on. After all, Scott likely considered this to be the end of the MCI story, hence why FNAF 4 would go on to expand on Happiest Day, implying the good ending was intended to be canon. But I believe it was after everyone getting confused about the lore, Scott locked away the box, locked away the good ending, noticeably locked behind 2 locks. I believe this is where Scott decided that in order to get everyone back on track, he would bring the kids back just for a little bit longer, so that he could clear up some miscommunications and finally cut off the loose ends. After all, while no one brings it up, it's likely the original Fright's guard was intended to die in that fire, hence why there's no fire slip or paycheck. That would make the only characters to survive being William, the puppet, and whoever was inside of the golden Freddy suit. And before Cassidy receivers pull up, I see no world where FNAF 4 introduces a completely new character who's intended to pass on immediately after his appearance. At least with Andrew, he still, goes on to have a book series to explain what happens after that, whereas the Crying Child is just shoved into the MCI's memories before being let go, or that Shadow Freddy has no real event tied to him until that point. I don't see it happening. Funnily enough, those characters surviving, we have the exact same characters who were believed to have survived the FNAF 6 fire added on later on. So, to recap, instead of Remnant being William's original motive for Follow Me, rather it was him trying to collect Agony. We can see with Shadow Freddy that it's a character that listens to William, more likely because of William manipulating the Agony in some way. After all, the character is believed to be the result of the Bite of 83, which means if the character believed it was getting revenge on Micheal, or that his father was trying to put him back together, it would work for him, regardless of the fact that William would be lying. The retcon would add one more thing he was harvesting: their remnant, their other memories. He would then go on to melt those down and put them inside of the fun times before getting himself spring-locked. Micheal, likely also under William's leash, is told to help put his sister back together, more so to have Micheal die, and possibly become another soul for William to control. However, Circus Baby has been stuck with her programming that stops her from having her bad memories. That's what I believe the green keypad is for. A lock holding back the event that took her life away, and likely the abuse William had put her through, all in order to make her a cooperative puppet. But Elizabeth had Micheal remove the lock, allowing her to shed her skin, or her pain and agony, shoving what remains into Micheal as a way of keeping him alive. That's why we can play only one minigame in Sister Location, that being the event of her getting scooped. We slowly watch as Michael's body decays with a robot inside of him becoming a shade of purple and having the exact same black scleras and white irises, suggesting the thing keeping him alive isn't average memories, but rather Elizabeth's agony. Remember how I mentioned the contents of the box had changed over time? Well, I think it was implying that despite the agony of the MCI's death, the pieces that William could manipulate at the least at the time, hence the absence of the phantoms in FNAF 6, had passed on. But the box had been closed because there was suddenly another key needed to set them free, which we see occur during the events of FNAF 6. The final attempt to fix what William had caused, as Henry brought them all together in one place. The pieces put back together. Molten Freddy being the remains of the MCI and Bite victim, Elizabeth, Charlie captured by Lefty, William, and Micheal. After all, we find out in this game that fire neutralizes Remnant, which means when the fire occurs, the final piece holding Bite victim in the MCI to this world finally lets go. Hence why this ends by showing the graves of the MCI children and who I believe to be Bite victim, suggesting that they had finally moved on. With Elizabeth's remnant being neutralized, Micheal was finally able to let go, ending their story as well, allowing only the puppet, William, and Cassidy to be the only ones who survived the fire, continuing their story into Frights by introducing Andrew as the person who's been keeping William alive this entire time. Eleanor is a character I'm not, fully understanding of, but with both Cassidy and Andrew alive, either of them could be the reason why she's still around despite the rest of the MCI passing on. And just like that, we have a timeline that makes Molten MCI make sense, and a solid understanding of the difference between Agony and Remnant. Well, until someone eats me up for it anyway. If you have any other ideas for how this theory might work, or any issues with it, let me know in the comments down below. I'll see you all again with more weird theories. I hope you liked it, and if you did, consider subscribing. I don't really mention that sort of stuff at the end of videos, but I figure I should. You know, call to action and all that. And until I see you guys again, matane.